Hello, welcome back to the Red Lettuce. We are really excited to have our good comrade Ben Norton on.
I
Ben's a journalist. What?
I love singing intros.
I'm gonna
I'm gonna
start.
try that sometime.
Okay, do it. Do it. I'm just gonna. Should I sing the whole thing? No, I can't do that. No, gonna be no one's gonna. People are gonna unsubscribe. They're gonna be like, oh, no.
Actually, no, it actually might get us more subscribers because you actually do have a good voice. It's true.
Welcome back to the Red Lettuce. We are joined with. Let's see, now I can't do.
So you're not gonna sing the intro with the Internationale theme?
Welcome back to the Red Lettuce. We are joined with-
Welcome back to the Red Lettuce.
There it is. That's all.
Goodbye. I am Ben.
Ben is a. See, now I'm getting the Internationale and the anthem of the Soviet Union like mixed up.
You don't even want me to attempt, because then we'll definitely lose all the subscribers that we have.
Oh, now I can't remember how it goes.
What?
I'm a bad communist.
The Internationale?
Yeah.
Arise, ye workers of something. Arise. Da, 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 da. Ba, 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 da, 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 da. Ba, da, 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 da. Ba, da, 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 da.
There you go.
See, now I'm like entranced. You have put the red lettuce under your Ben Norton spell. Okay, so yeah, now I can't. I'm sorry. I'm feeling intimidated.
Don't feel intimidated. I don't know any of the lyrics. I just know the melody.
I didn't want you to attempt to even do the melody either.
I didn't even sing it well. I sang it so badly.
I'm gonna sing it terribly. I'm just gonna go for it. Welcome back to the Reds. No, now I'm nervous.
It's cool. You already did the intro.
I did like a third of the intro, Ben.
I think we've done the intro 3 times, so that's a full intro.
You know.
Yes.
You're right. Third time's a charm. Okay, Ben is a writer, filmmaker, assistant editor.
No, just start over.
Okay.
Start over.
No, we got to keep this. This is like podcast classic gold.
It is. Okay.
We have to start being messy on the podcast, or no one's going to listen to us.
Right. You do have to make mistakes, like Lennon said.
I know.
No, you got to. Well, true, but you just got to sing.
Welcome back to the Red Lettuce. We're joined with Ben Norton, who's a journalist and writer, filmmaker, assistant at the Gray Zone.
Excellent.
Thank you. We can do some Ariana Grande too, like that was good, right?
Yes, it was good.
Got to auto-tune it.
That's what she does. So it's only fair.
I actually sound worse without a tune. I'm just letting you know.
Thank you. Next.
Thank you. Next. Thank you. I wish I could be rich like her and make an album in a week, and then like everybody loves me. You know, my favorite white woman of color is Ariana Grande.
My favorite Italian Latina.
Okay, all right. Ben, thank you so much for hanging out with us. We really appreciate it. We have a shit ton of questions for you and a wide variety of topics. So if you think you know where it's gonna go, you won't. It's just gonna be a scary, bumpy ride. And
Those are the best interviews.
Oh, great. Okay.
Roller coaster.
So can you like give us? So you're going to Ecuador soon. Can you give us an update on what's going on in Ecuador and maybe Nicaragua, and talk about the work you're doing there, just to start start us off.
Yeah. So just for people to get a timeline, today is January 28th. On February 7th, there's going to be an election ostensibly in Ecuador. And Ecuador currently, to the extent it even has a sovereign government, it's governed by this right-wing president named Lenin Moreno. Unfortunately, his name, yes, is Lenin. So people will sometimes say in Latin America, I'll say it in Spanish and then translate it. They usually say something along the lines of, es un traidor no solo a su país, no solo a su patria, sino a su propio nombre. So he's a traitor not only to his country, not only to his homeland, but also to his own name.
Mm.
He is a right-wing, extremely corrupt leader who is really a puppet of the US. He also is really absent, and he hasn't really been seen much during the COVID pandemic. He's been hiding in his lair, like Joe Biden's basement, the Ecuadorian equivalent of that. And what's interesting is that the worst part of Moreno is that he was actually a vice president of the former leftist president, Rafael Correa, who, I mean, he was certainly had some issues, but he was definitely a very progressive force. He he was pretty anti-imperialist, but he has since become a very staunch anti-imperialist, seeing what Washington has done to his country. He's a friend of Venezuela. He was just in Venezuela for the December National Assembly election. And Rafael Correa launched a progressive movement, you can say kind of social democratic, but anti-imperialist movement that's called the Citizens Revolution. Kind of a cheesy name, but the Ecuadorian left is very weak, and he has been really one of the only forces in recent Ecuadorian history on the left to win state power and to, take his country at least away out of the U.S. colonial trap it's been stuck in. And Moreno has taken it back. So, for instance, there used to be there's an island that belongs to Ecuador, and there used to be a U.S. military base there. And the former president Correa kicked out the U.S. military base. And then when the U.S. wanted to come back, Correa said to the U.S., he told Julian Assange in an interview, okay, fine, you can reestablish your military base on our island if you allow us to establish an Ecuadorian military base in the United States. And of course, the U.S. said no to that, but pretty baller move.
Mhm.
So Correa's he's a pretty interesting leader, the best Ecuador has to offer. And his kind of political, he wanted to run for president, but Moreno, this corrupt right-wing US-backed leader, would not allow that. I mean, Ecuador it's not even really a bourgeois democracy anymore. It's basically a dictatorship. And so Correa was banned, and he has over 20 fake charges against him, ranging from corruption to murder, all these ridiculous, bogus, politically motivated charges. So his kind of political mentor is named Arauz, who is a 35-year-old left-wing economist, socialist. He is leading in all of the polls to be president. So we'll see what happens. If there is an actual free election, he's going to win. And he's already promised that he's going to cancel the deals with the IMF, and he's going to refuse to pay the debt that the current neoliberal regime took from the IMF, which is billions of dollars. He's just going to refuse to pay it, and he's going to work with China instead. So the US has been forcing the current neoliberal regime under Moreno to try to basically privatize the central bank. They've been implementing all of these austerity policies and trying to do a lot of damage to prevent Arauz from being able to govern effectively. We'll see what happens, but I mean, this guy had single digit approval ratings recently, Moreno. So it's just another classic example of how in Latin America, the US installs these neoliberal puppet regimes that, like with the far right regime of Bolsonaro in Brazil right now, they try to just privatize everything and push through all of these unpopular policies and fuck up the economy. And then when a left-wing leader comes into power, their hands are so tied by the IMF debt trap and all of that. And some of these leaders learned, and they're just like, screw it. I'm just going to say fuck you to the IMF and work with China.
Because China is just like, yeah, let me just forgive this debt. I don't really care.
Well, I mean, the difference is that it's true that China has forgiven a lot of Cuban debt, actually billions of dollars of Cuban debt. But the thing is, the IMF debt is basically, I mean, the US basically controls the IMF.
Mhm.
So the thing is, if Ecuador refuses to pay the IMF debt, I mean, there are actions the US can take, of course, in terms of sanctions and other policies. But China, when it gives loans to other countries, it's not through the IMF or the World Bank. It's usually through like the like the Asian Developmental Bank or something like that. So it's an independent institution. It offers an actual alternative for these countries to try to develop.
And they're not like tacking on structural adjustment programs to these loans.
No, exactly. I mean, they are loans, to be fair, so they're not. It's not free money, but usually they're very low interest, and China has forgiven a lot of them. And in fact, even the Financial Times, which is the voice of the bourgeoisie, published a really good article acknowledging that China has, with its deals, with its loans in the global south, with dozens of its loans to numerous countries, it has forgiven the loans, pardoned part of the loans, or even just dropped the loans altogether in the case of Cuba and Zimbabwe and some other countries. So, yeah, I mean, obviously China is interested in mutual development. So it's not just giving free money. Like the idea is to work together to develop both of the countries, but it's not like it's totally different in political and economic character from the IMF loans, which are they're not really loans so much as they're just a kind of neo-colonial debt trap that all of these right-wing governments do, like the right-wing government in Argentina before under Mauricio Macri. He this total neoliberal. He took the largest IMF loan in history at over $56 billion, which in the US and Western Europe might not sound like a lot. I mean, it's a lot of money, but in Argentina, that's an insane amount of money. And just trapped the country in a neo-colonial debt trap. So the country has very few decisions it can make. It has very little economic sovereignty. So, and a lot of these countries, they actually do that on purpose. The right-wing regimes, they take those loans on purpose, not necessarily because they need the money. They actually, I mean, they don't use that money to invest in actual development of infrastructure like the Chinese loans are for, like building roads and bridges and hospitals. No. In the case of Macri, he took all this money. He didn't use it to develop the country. He used it to pay for all of these contracts to companies to benefit his political clients and corruption. And he actually didn't even spend all the money, which is why the current government's trying to refuse to spend the rest. So, I mean, it just shows that when the US, through these institutions, claims that it's going to offer loans for development, it's not actually for development. So then all these countries in global south say, yeah, I'm going to get loans from China because it's actually interested in development.
Yeah, China is about win-win cooperation. That's what socialism is about. And, imperialism is about underdeveloping these countries, and that's what the IMF is about. It's an imperialist institution.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the textbook. And the thing about the IMF is that when we talk about imperialism, there's different elements, right? There's the kind of blunt military force of an invasion, of bombing, and the US frequently does that. But then the institutional mechanisms that keep imperialism as a system, as the dominant force, as the highest stage of capitalism, the military is the last stage, honestly, and it's the most obvious, the most blunt. But the economic institutions that keep imperialism and capitalism as a global system running are the IMF, the World Bank, the fact that the US is the de facto, I mean, the US dollar is the de facto global currency reserve. So many countries around the world have to buy US dollars to do international trade to buy oil because Saudi Arabia, which is effectively a colony of the United States, sells most of its oil, basically all of its oil until recently, in US dollars, which is why it's called the petrodollar. And so many countries, when they have money, they invest in US bonds because of the way that the US dollar is effectively the most, I mean, because the US dollar is a floating currency, it's no longer pegged to gold as it was until 1971, until Nixon took it off. So basically the only thing that keeps the US dollar the de facto global currency reserve is through military force. So it's dialectically reinforcing the economic institutions and military force. And then any country that tries to get off of that, like Muammar Gaddafi, who tried to create a gold-backed Pan-African currency, that country is destroyed by U.S. military force.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Actually, in this next question I have, we're going to go, hopefully we'll dive deeper into like what imperialism actually, how it originated and what it means. So Ben, as you know, there's an entity in the US called the synthetic left that engages in destructive identity politics and settler discourse, which claims that the primary contradiction is race, not class. How does this benefit the ruling elite, and how can we defeat this ideological view? And also talk about the historical development of settler colonialism, but not just in the US, but in the Americas in general, along with imperialism, and why racism and white supremacy aren't the primary drivers of these two different stages of capitalist development.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a complex contradiction to unpack because I'm sympathetic to, and I largely agree with an analysis that some MLM folks have put forward, and I think it's largely correct that of course, it's totally opposed to the liberal ID Paul analysis, but that rather that race in the context of, well, really in general around the world, but especially in the United States, race is a form of class. So it's not like pitting race and class against each other. It's that the struggle against white supremacy is a class struggle because race is class. And one of the people I saw write about this in a very interesting way, and I'm not saying that I agree with everything and endorse everything that he has written, but it's Jay Sakai. People, the meme, read Settlers. And what's interesting about Sakai, who is a Maoist, comes from MLM background, and I don't agree with some of his views at all, really, but I think some of his views are correct and very interesting. And by the way, on Settlers, he actually later wrote an update to Settlers more recently, where he kind of revises parts of his thesis, and I agree more with his revised version. Like I don't fundamentally agree with the idea that like there can't be like that they're like, I mean, that's a very long, complex argument. So anyway, I'll just leave by saying that I actually don't agree with key elements of Settlers, but
Yeah, I mean,
sorry.
Sorry, yeah, no, neither do we. We've talked about that.
Yeah, and I'm not a Maoist. But I'm not. But the thing about what's interesting about what Sakai wrote later in his updated version, and I think he also wrote about this in The Shock of Recognition, which is an essay that I actually think I agree with much more, and is a brilliant analysis of fascism. It's one of the most brilliant analyses of fascism I've read. And I think it's in that essay or in his update, his update where he revises parts of the Settlers thesis. He talks about how, and it's not just his thesis, how the creation of whiteness and white supremacy and race were part of the creation of classes in the United States. And he has this hilarious line about how the U.S. puts, the U.S. like imprints like class on every element of society, including our own assholes. So why wouldn't they do it on race? So when you think about, there's another really interesting book, not to like name drop all these books, but I'm not an expert on this stuff, and I'm explaining it through my thoughts on these based on some of these books that I've read and some different and interesting analyses. There's another really brilliant book on this topic called The Invention of the White Race. And
Peter Allen.
Theodore Allen, yeah. And it's a class analysis of the origins of race and whiteness. And the point is that the liberal ID, Paul, argument that has become very popular, it's in vogue, even among ruling class elements in the United States. And we see this with the New York Times, with this new program of trying to rewrite American history to center white supremacy, which might seem like a progressive step, but they're also writing out materialism. So it's a non-materialist attempt to tell the history of the United States through the lens of white supremacy. And it's using, not to name drop another person, but what Barbara Fields, another brilliant historian, wrote in her book Racecraft. And so all of these scholars I'm talking about, they've done a much more thorough job than I can do. I'm just going to summarize their arguments. But Barbara Fields talks about racecraft, where she talks about racecraft. It's a play off witchcraft, how liberals have tried to create a non-materialist understanding of racism to try to explain history as a form of witchcraft, but it's racecraft. So to them, it's this kind of irrational, just hatred of black people, and the idea that race is totally, and racism is an idealist construct, going back to the philosophical understanding of idealism. And liberalism is fundamentally an idealist ideology. It's a non-materialist ideology that doesn't understand the material contradictions that give rise to class struggle and historical change and progressive change. So they think that white people just hated black people, and that's why the US is the way it is, because there's just this intractable hatred of black people and also Latino people. But the reality is that Europeans didn't colonize the so-called Americas because they just hated brown people and then they hated black people to make them slaves. No, it was fundamentally a process of accumulation of capital, which is primitive accumulation, which is what gives rise to capitalism. And you can go back. I mean, Marx himself wrote about this. And by the way, part of this liberal ID, Paul, critique is it's leveled against Marxism to try to turn people like Karl Marx into, quote unquote, just another white man, which is insane. I mean, first of all, it's totally historically illiterate, because you can't just map on current understandings of whiteness onto the 1800s in Germany, especially onto someone who, by the way, was Jewish. I mean, it's totally absurd. But the point is that liberals don't have a materialist understanding of why white supremacy was created. And if you go back to the invention of the white race, basically it boils down to the thesis is that in order to divide the American working class, even before the country was officially declared and the process was settler colonization, you have to develop this kind of new form of caste, basically. I mean, it's part of class. It's like a kind of caste system, which is race, right? And so you have certain workers who are allowed to be accepted into whiteness. So at first, actually, if you look at the waves of migration in the United States, it's that certain groups that are now considered white, like Jews, Poles, many Catholic groups like Irish and Italians, were not considered white, and they were slowly allowed to be accepted into whiteness as a way of dividing those workers from Black workers and Latino workers and other workers. So the liberal understanding would have us think that, I mean, it's incredible that they would have us think that slavery was about racism and not about slavery. The point of slavery is they're exploiting slave labor as free labor to steal their labor. I mean, when we talk about primitive accumulation and the theft of we're talking about the labor theory of value. And the point of understanding capitalism is that what makes you a worker? You're a worker because you sell your labor and then get a wage. And you're a capitalist because you don't sell your work. You don't sell your labor, rather. You own capital and you make money off of that capital. So the point of slave labor is it's the most brutal form of exploitation of that labor, where you physically own the human as capital. And that was the point of slavery. And white supremacy was an ideology created post facto to justify that material exploitation, which, by the way, when we're also talking about the origins of imperialism, this is happening at the time of European colonialism in its early stages, which is what gives birth to both capitalism and imperialism. So when we understand Lenin's thesis of capitalism as the highest stage of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, we also have to understand colonialism as what gives birth to capitalism. There is no capitalism without European colonialism. So the European conquest of Africa through colonization of Africa and slave labor, and then also European colonization of the Americas, that is what gives rise to primitive accumulation. And I mentioned Marx. Marx himself wrote in Capital in 1867 that, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's very similar to his quote. He said, the hunting of black skins in Africa and the entombment of the indigenous in mines was the rosy dawn of primitive accumulation, the rosy dawn of capital. And he himself is acknowledging that capitalism itself was created through colonialism. And then imperialism is later, which we can talk about, is the highest stage of capitalism through the development, through overthrowing feudal societies, feudal conditions, giving rise to, through bourgeois revolution, to capitalism. And then eventually when the entire world, when everything is colonized and forced into capitalism, then you have imperialism. So the point is that it isn't, this is a long answer and it's kind of convoluted, and I'll cut back to you in a second. But the reason I wanted to spell all that out is because at the same time, well, I think we need to be fierce in our criticism of liberals who are trying to turn race into racecraft, really into this kind of liberal idealist understanding of racism, as if it's just rooted in people's ideas and their personal irrational bigotries and hatreds, which are real, by the way. Those are very real, but those are products of a class society in which Black people and Latino people and indigenous people were intentionally kept at the bottom of the economic totem pole so their labor could be exploited, so they could be super exploited. So there could be this kind of caste system, which is fundamentally a kind of racial class system where white workers were given preferential treatment. But it was fundamentally based on class and the exploitation of Black labor. It wasn't because they just had some irrational hatred of Black people. It was fundamentally built on the exploitation of labor. But at the same time, there's also this left liberal social democratic understanding, which is the opposite, the kind of Jacobin types who are totally trying to write out race whatsoever and ignore race. And what they do is they take the kind of liberal color blindness, this ridiculous like bourgeois liberal understanding, which used to be in vogue among Democrats, although now they're going in the opposite direction with this like racecraft argument. And so the kind of left liberal social democrat types, they're trying to say that race is entirely a distraction and we shouldn't talk about race in the United States. And that's an equally idealist understanding. But the difference is that is portrayed as a materialist understanding, that economistic argument. But actually the reality is that we have to understand race. We can't remove race from the argument. We have to understand the materialist elements of race, and not as some cultural phenomenon as these like New York Times types want us to.
No, yeah, and we definitely have to start looking at racism for what it is, and it's rooted in bourgeois ideology to divide the proletariat, and that's the origins of it, and that's what it's been to this day. And the reason why we're plundering the global South is not because of the color of their skin, but their material resources. So, but they use that as a justification. So, and the issue with Sakai is that, first of all, no one's ever seen this person.
Yeah.
No one knows who the hell he is. And his book to me is very anti-Marxist.
Settlers.
Settlers, yeah. Settlers is very anti-Marxist to me. It's not very materialist. I mean, the whole idea of, you know, the white proletariat is inherently petty bourgeois, um, doesn't really check out for me, especially now. I
Yeah,
mean,
it's objectively not true.
right. So his
I
main
mean, good luck telling that to Appalachian miners who are like now living in opioid like just hellscapes, and they have no jobs, and now because of mountaintop removal, their cancer rates are 3,000 times up, and they die of pancreatic cancer at like age 33, and when they turn on their water faucets, it's like this brown liquid because it's been poisoned. I mean, that's
they're the
it's a
same as Jeff
it's a ridiculous
Bezos.
argument.
They're the same as Jeff Bezos. They're the same. But yeah, and I mean his main point is like, you know, the labor aristocracy. Okay, great. That doesn't exist anymore. The labor aristocracy is now virtually gone. So we're in a different stage of imperialism. And I've only heard Caleb like mention like what it is. We're in the period of accumulation through destruction, where we're underdeveloping
Yeah.
the first world. And I think that has given us it is kind of laid the foundation for solidarity among the proletariat in the U.S. It's probably greater than ever than it has in a very long time. The opportunity and the stage for us to come together as a united proletariat is now's the time, because we're in a deep crisis. There's no more good paying jobs. We're in a police state, low wage police state, a failed low wage police state, and I think that book is no longer relevant.
Yeah, and one other quick note on that. I mean, the reason I mentioned Sakai is like I was saying. I mean, I don't endorse the thesis of settlers. I think it's wrong, but the reason I mentioned Sakai is because I was just saying that later on when he updated it, and then also in the essay, which I actually would recommend. I would not recommend settlers, and I think the whole read settlers meme is actually kind of destructive.
Yeah.
And but his essay, The Shock of Recognition, which he wrote much later, is actually a very brilliant analysis of fascism and class society. But I just mentioned it because of that idea that we have to understand race through class analysis.
Right. We should not ignore the issues of racism, that's for sure.
Well, but I also say it because race, you know, liberals will say race is a social construct, which is true. And then they'll be like, then 5 seconds after saying that, they'll like measure your blood quanta to see how much blackness you have in your blood.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah.
But the reality is that, yes, it's true. Race is a social construct. That's true. And it's a class construct.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at, I mean, all you have to do is look at the way that Jim Crow worked. And what's so incredible is that, you know, these liberals will talk about the history of slavery and remove the material element of exploitation of black slave labor. And they'll talk about Jim Crow. But Jim Crow was an apartheid system. And just like with apartheid South Africa, they were forcing black people to do all of the horrible, shitty jobs that no one wanted to do and to get paid nothing for it. And I mean, it's also a form of kind of caste, which is, I mean, I like the term caste because caste helps you understand better that it's kind of like a racial caste system. It's like, it's a combination of the two. And it was fundamentally about keeping the lowest level of this caste system, this racial class system of jobs that people didn't want to do and forcing them to do it. And now, by the way, who does that now? Undocumented immigrants.
Right.
So effectively, it's the same system of, I mean, it's not de jure like legal apartheid, But those same jobs are now fulfilled not by Black people living under apartheid, but rather by undocumented immigrants who do not have the same political rights in society, and they're forced to live on the margins of society, and they're forced to do these backbreaking jobs. Oh, and by the way, and it's also prison labor, of course, which is slave labor essentially. So by after formally abolishing slavery and bringing on wage slavery, well, the US has basically gone back to chattel slavery. And anyway, the point is that all of this is fundamentally about super exploitation, because all of us as workers were exploited. All workers are exploited. If you sell your labor, you're exploited.
Right.
And that's where surplus value comes from. But then there's super exploitation, and frequently super exploitation of labor is done in the global south, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, in Honduras, in so many countries, in China until recently. But now through prison labor, that super exploitation is also being done to slave labor in prisons.
The 13th Amendment says slavery is abolished unless it serves as punishment for a crime, and it just blows my mind that people don't make that connection. You know, we have more people in prison than we have per capita than China does, and like they have literally like 800 million more people than we do, and that like just it's so crazy. Like that's fucking crazy. And then like they try to push these like, oh, there's a million Uyghurs in like, and I'm just like, okay. You don't really care about slaves here, so why do you care about slaves in China? Oh, well, there's an ulterior motive there. And it's never the like freedom of oppressed people. It's never that. They always like find a way to fall for like how the media is literally creating a racialized class of China. You know, they never talk about the Chinese government. They always talk about China. Like the media understands that Chinese people make up the government there because they have a dictatorship of the proletariat, but like they're being racist, like when they're talking about foreign policy in China, and that's how they're like pushing like this new Cold War with China.
Yeah, and I think that when we're talking about these two things are so interrelated. When I think of racism, I think of imperialism, because when liberals think of racism, they think of white supremacy as like this nebulous force out in the ether, like a platonic ideal, like going. I mean, it really is an ideal. It is an idealist understanding in the same way that platonic ideals are. Like the ideal of the tree, and every tree is just trying to. Every tree is a resemblance of that platonic ideal. It's insane. It's batshit dumb liberal ideology. The reality is that we have to understand racism as a material force in the same way as imperialism, and they're inextricably related because they're basically the same thing. And it's also really related to whiteness and the fact that imperialism, in the stage of capitalism, when we talk about imperialism, it's referring to a very particular phase of capitalism and the development of capitalism, when European colonial powers, and to a lesser extent Japan and I mean parts of there are other parts outside of Europe as well. Mostly Japan was an example, but it's largely Western Europe and then the United States and Canada. When these countries had colonized the entire world and effectively pushed through these kind of capitalist developments against feudal conditions. I mean, it's not really developing the country, but overturning feudal conditions in areas, often through settler colonization. I mean, brutal genocidal colonization, forced population transfer, genocide, and then creating a capitalist system. When all of that is done throughout the world, then you have intercapitalist rivalry, which gives rise to imperialism and gives rise to World War I, World War II. The World War II is obviously more complicated because you have socialism as an alternative to intercapitalist rivalry. But the point is that, okay, that's the stage we're talking about of imperialism under capitalism. It's true that imperialism predates capitalism in a different way, though. When we're talking about pre-capitalist imperialism, it's still materialist, it's still economic, but it's not the same way that Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg were talking about imperialism, or much later thinkers who are also brilliant and should be looked at in terms of their analysis, like, you know, Lacerdo, Domenico Lacerdo, brilliant analyst of imperialism and the role of China. So there's a lot of really brilliant modern analyses of imperialism we should look at as well. But going back to the point I was going to get at with pre-capitalist imperialism, if you think about pre-capitalist imperialism and the way that, like, the Ottoman Empire or the Mughal Empire or there's so many different empires you could talk about. And those were empires, of course, that we have to have a materialist understanding. They were fundamentally based on expanding the empire to take more natural resources, to exploit labor. They also had slaves. Slavery, of course, was not new, but they didn't have white supremacy because they were exploiting slave labor, but they weren't doing it to one particular racial group. The Europeans did use slave labor to a particular racial group of Africans, of dark-skinned, largely Africans. And white supremacy was the tool they created to justify that slavery and colonization. But it's the same form of colonization and slavery and imperialism that had existed in pre-capitalist imperialism. The difference is that it was white people doing it, like white people in scare quotes. So we have to understand that. And that's also why it's so inextricably linked to imperialism, because it's through the process of imperialism that white supremacy is created. It's through the process of European colonization. It's not in the United States, like in these neat borders. By the way, we should also understand this process of not including just the enslavement of Africans, but also settler colonialism and genociding its native peoples, because the reality is that while imperialism is developing under capitalism, it's also when the Europeans are colonizing Africa, you have the Berlin Conference. When Europeans are colonizing the Americas, well, you should also keep in mind that throughout this time, the United States is also expanding westward. And the United States didn't really have formal colonies in the way Europeans did, although Puerto Rico is definitely a colony. Hawaii is definitely a colony.
Mhm.
Alaska.
And but the reality is that while the Europeans were expanding their colonial conquest of these different parts of the global South, the British in India, the Dutch in Indonesia, the United States as a project was expanding westward, and that was its form of colonial expansion. And white supremacy was created through that process of colonization of the Americas. So we have to understand it as race and imperialism as basically part of the same thing, because race is the product of imperialism. And that's why Chinese people are now increasingly being pushed away from whiteness, because whiteness is entirely a product of politics. Liberals will correctly say that whiteness is a cultural construct. It's true. It's a social construct. It's a social construct that's a result of the material conditions of imperialist and capitalist society at this particular moment. And there was a period when China, after the Sino-Soviet split, which we can talk about, talking about one of my fundamental disagreements with Maoism, I think was a very fundamental, huge flaw with Maoism. And not to say that, I mean, it's a complex argument, but not to say that the Soviet Union didn't have many problems. It certainly did. And there was definitely an element of chauvinism in relations between the Soviet Union and China. That's true. I mean, and Khrushchev, who, by the way, I mean, I think he was by definition a revisionist, and I think that thesis is correct. That critique of Khrushchevian revisionism, and he was very, you read some of his correspondence, he was frankly racist and chauvinist against Chinese people, and there's a long history. It's a very complex argument. We don't have time to get into that, but the point is that after the Sino-Soviet split, and after Nixon visits China from 1972 on, China increasingly, for a period until the overthrow of the Soviet Union and Tiananmen Square, China actually really kind of allied with US imperialism against the Soviet Union. That's the reality. And we can see that even with the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. We can see that with China actually supporting the Shah in Iran.
And Pinochet, they supported too.
And Pinochet, they actually sent money to Pinochet.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an example of how Maoism can actually, in some ways, become explicitly pro-imperialist. But anyway, I'm throwing out a lot of points. I have a tendency to get on the sides and not be direct in my thoughts. But the point I was going to say is that when China was going through that phase of the 1970s forward and integrating more with Western capitalism and allying with imperialism, there was a time when like Chinese people were allowed to be integrated into whiteness in a way. And you hear this racist concept in the United States of the model minority, right? Of East Asian Americans integrating, assimilating into American culture. And that was only allowed because it was allowed simultaneously when China was integrating into Western capital, with integrating with Western capital and into Western imperialism. And the more that China decouples from Western capital and develops its own economic and political system, which is the process we're living through right now. And Xi Jinping has made that very clear as one of his political goals. And the new Cold War is accelerating that process of decoupling. The more and more that happens, the more and more the concept of whiteness is going to change in response to those political conditions and re-orientalize Chinese people and to destroy that myth of the model minority, which is a racist myth, and not allow Chinese people to assimilate into whiteness. So again, I mean, I'm ranting here, but the point is that we understand, liberals understand, they claim to say that they understand that whiteness is a social construct, but they don't understand the materialist analysis of how whiteness shifts in response to the prerogatives of empire and capital. And when relations with China got better, they were allowed to assimilate into whiteness. And as relations with China get much worse, they're no longer allowed to assimilate into whiteness, and the yellow peril is back.
Yep. I've been saying this for so long, and like people think I'm crazy. I saw a lot of people, particularly like people I'm friends with on Facebook, some people I know in real life who are like especially over the summer, when lots of Chinese people were experiencing a lot like heavy xenophobia due to coronavirus. Like I heard a lot of like this like Black nationalist kind of like, oh, I don't feel bad for Asians. And I'm just like, why don't you see what's happening right now, right in front of you? It's right there. Like you said it so well. They're being reorientalized, and the media is creating they're shifting China into a racialized class to justify imperialism against them, and that like. I don't know. That was really validating. Like you said it so well. Like I feel really justified in all the like really heavy Facebook conversations I've had with like.
Well, two more quick thoughts on this. I'll try to keep it short because I know I'm blabbering here, but these are complex things. Two things that come to mind that are very instructive examples recently.
Yeah.
One is Russia and Russians.
Yes.
Because this is a classic example of how whiteness is a product of imperialism and class. And I mean, imperialism is class, right? It's about class. It's about global class conflict. So Russians, are they white? It's an interesting question. And maybe if you ask that under Boris Yeltsin or something, or maybe a little later, like in the early 2000s under Medvedev, maybe a lot of Americans would have said, yeah. But I think increasingly, look at this insane anti-Russian xenophobia in the United States. You know, liberals will often say correctly that racism is bigotry plus power. And they'll be like, well, you can't be racist against white people because white people have power. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's true. Now, but let's also apply that same logic to empire, right? So what's interesting is that they won't apply that same thing to Russia and the attempt by the US to recolonize Russia as it did with Yeltsin, to balkanize Russia, and not just the US, but NATO and the European Union, and to prevent Russia from being an independent sovereign country. And how the same attacks, the same imperialist attacks on Russia are accompanied by dehumanization of Russian people and Slavic people in general. And the idea that they're like these shifty Slavs who just don't share our values. And it shows how it's the same idea of like the white man's burden, because that those racist ideas are used to justify the material actions being done through politics, through empire. And if you look at how Russians are treated, even in mainstream corporate media right now, it's similar to the kind of racist stereotypes that Black people used to be treated with. I mean, it's different. It's the specific stereotypes are different, but like the way that Russians are talked about, it's like the way that in the 60s and 70s that like the Blacks in scare quotes were talked about. Like the Russians are in, there's something in their genetics that makes them dishonest. It's
Right.
like, it's like white supremacists saying there's something in Black people's genetics that make them lazy. I mean, it's the same kind of lazy.
Nazis. They sound an awful lot like the Nazis. Like I'm so sick of like liberals calling everybody like fascists and Nazis except for themselves, because that's what they do. This is like it's so unbelievably frustrating to watch. Like they're like, why are you so mean to liberals? I thought you were a leftist. Yes, I am a leftist. Democrats are right wing. Period. Like they sound an awful lot like racist Republicans right now.
Well, the other example that came to mind, really quickly is something I've been thinking about, and how this kind of liberal racecraft ideology, this liberal idealism, is also applied sometimes to the Middle East.
Yes.
And you see this with like the whole discussion of agency. Like they always talk about the agency. We talk about the agency of the Syrian people. The same people saying that are the ones who are advocating for the U.S. and Israel to recolonize Syria and to destroy a sovereign post-colonial government. And they say, listen to the agency of people who are working for the Central Intelligence Agency, is what they're saying. But it's interesting to see how Orientalism is discussed, because often in academia, which is full of these like rad libs, these liberal neoliberal identitarians, they talk about Orientalism as a strictly cultural phenomenon, ignoring the political material elements of imperialism. I can't tell you how many articles I've read and essays I've read where Orientalism is thrown around as a strictly cultural term, ignoring European colonialism, as if Orientalism was just a bunch of Europeans with these backward views about people in the Middle East, and they wrote some books and did some art. And to be fair, I mean, I really respect Edward Said in some ways, but I remember reading Orientalism, his book, and he never talks about imperialism. He never talks about politics. All he talks about, if you read the book, and this isn't to say that Edward Said doesn't have other good books and other good contributions. I mean, he did a lot of good work, but as a book, Orientalism, all it does is look at the intellectual work of European artists and historians and novelists and poets. He's not actually doing a political materialist analysis of European colonization of the Middle East, and then how, and even the term Middle East, which is itself a product of that, of Western Asia, of European colonization, and how Orientalism was the ideology used to justify European colonization. And I think of it now where, think about how Saudi Arabia is discussed and think about how Iran is discussed. Iran is an Islamic republic. You know, criticisms aside, and there's criticisms, but it has a Republican government, it has an elected president, and it has much more rights for women and other civil rights than in Saudi Arabia, which is a feudal, which is like this weird combination of feudalism and techno-capitalism, dystopianism. I mean, but Iran has a revolutionary, but also a kind of revolutionary bourgeois government. They had a bourgeois revolution against a monarchy that was a puppet of imperialism, and they have an anti-imperialist government, whereas Saudi Arabia is basically a colony and has an absolute monarchy. But if you listen to the way that Iran is discussed, the mullahs, the theocracy, how many liberals do you hear condemning the theocratic Wahhabi monarchs in Saudi Arabia? They're not, because
Never. And
the point is that
they'll talk about again, I'm going to use the Uyghurs as a reference point here, because the United States is trying to balkanize China, and the way they're doing that is by like they're literally pushing. They're saying it's genocide, but really what they're pushing is the Al Qaeda narrative that they're being targeted, and they're literally like sharing Al Qaeda propaganda, and it goes in one ear and out the other.
Well, the point really quickly I'm making is that Orientalism, if objectively speaking from a political perspective, Iran is a much more progressive society and country and government than Saudi Arabia is. But the Orientalist stereotypes and discussions and rhetoric is much more heavily targeted against Iran. And why? Because Orientalism is a tool of imperialism, and Iran is an obstacle to imperialism. That's why we don't hear those same discussions about Saudi Arabia. That's why Donald Trump, a white supremacist, can go sword dance with Saudi Arabia and with Steve Bannon, another white supremacist, and they don't sit around talking about the Saudi mullahs, because Saudi Arabia is a colony, and you don't need an Orientalism if the country already is colonized, and the ruling class is also itself deeply embedded in that colonial structure.
With Saudi Arabia,
those are very clear examples of how this ideology is a product of the material conditions and not vice versa.
Right. No, I'm 100% with you on that. Saudi Arabia be able to stand on its feet without weapons sales from the United States?
No.
I mean, Trump actually said that, and he was right. He let the cat out of the bag, which is why all the liberal imperialists hated him, because he just every once in a while accidentally said the truth of the empire, just bluntly. He bragged about it. He said, if it weren't for us, Saudi Arabia would collapse in a few weeks.
Absolutely. Let's move on to my second question.
Oh man, I'm sorry.
No, no, okay. No,
we're only on question 2.
No, we had you on because like we plan to ask you big questions because you give big answers. So it's fine. we're having a good discussion. So I'd rather have somebody on that talks a lot than not. So you guys do great work at the Gray Zone, deconstructing imperialist narratives, particularly when it comes to attacks on socialist and anti-imperialist countries. What are your thoughts on building socialism here in the U.S.? Because I get a sense that a lot of organizations and parties here like to focus on the revolutionary history and material conditions of nations under the boot of imperialism, and rightfully so. But I don't think enough attention is paid to our revolutionary history and current material conditions, which is ripe for working class solidarity and radical class analysis. Is it time to change tactics? And if so, what would that look like? And how would it advance the awakening and pre-Communist Party stage we are currently in? And why do you think that socialists seem to know more about great socialist leaders and movements in other countries and not their own? And what's the root cause of this? And what U.S. socialist leader stands out to you the most?
This is a really good question, and I'll start off by saying that I would not in any way call myself an expert on this topic, and I'm not an organizer, and I think there are people who are smarter about this and better, more analytical on this particular question than I am. But I'll share my thoughts on it because I have some thoughts.
Yeah.
First of all, I think we should understand that the U.S. is a unique country. The U.S. is a very unique country, and this gives rise to the question, why hasn't there been a strong socialist movement in the United States like in other Western European countries? The Italian Communist Party was a massive force. The French Communist Party, after World War II, massive political force. Why in the U.S. was it not in the same way? I think there's a few reasons. The brutal repression in the United States was much more violent. much more just heinous. The mass murder of labor organizers, the McCarthyite era and repression of the Communist Party and other progressive movements, and the first Red Scare, not just the second Red Scare. Let's not forget the first one. So I think that's part of it, but that's not a complete answer at all. Then there's the element of, we were talking about race, and I think that that's a key part of it. But we have to understand race again as part of the contradiction of empire, of imperialism. And I think this gets to the more fundamental answer of why the U.S. hasn't had a strong socialist movement in the same way. It's because of settler colonialism. Because these European countries, they have more complex histories, but the reality is that even though the version of like the Italian or German nation state as a current project is relatively new in the 1800s with national state formation, there still was a process of kind of social formation going back hundreds of years, unlike in the United States, which is, the United States is a country built on genocide and colonial expansion westward. And let's not forget that it's not even a contiguous project. Puerto Rico is a colony. Hawaii is a state, but it's a colony. Alaska is a colony / state. That it's ridiculous that these are states. That, like, why? It doesn't make any sense. But unless in the logic of imperialism and colonialism. So I think in the same way that the reason I say all that is because the analysis of the Communist Party of the United States, CPUSA, before it became a liberal institution, back when it at its peak stage, when it was very militant and huge and had thousands and thousands of members in the 1920s and 30s, it had an analysis of the Black Belt. And right. The understanding was that the United States has national oppression like other countries. And when we're talking about imperialism and talking about race, and I kept stressing that the creation of white supremacy is a product of capitalism and imperialism, just as the creation of Orientalism and the idea of the yellow peril and all of this is the product of capitalism and imperialism. Similarly, when we talk about national oppression, and going back to the CPUSA's analysis of Black oppression in the United States, the oppression of Black people as a form of national oppression, as Black people in the United States forming a coherent oppressed nation, and understanding that white supremacy was part of the process of basically keeping that oppressed nation kind of colonized through a system of apartheid. Just as in South Africa, the white colonial regime oppressed the Black population as a kind of colonial subaltern class. So I'm not saying that we should go back to that analysis at all. I don't think we're well beyond the Black Belt thesis that there should be this Black Belt socialist country, a socialist project created in the southeast of the United States. The only reason I mention that is because I think that was a very novel analysis of the United States, thinking about the United States as from a regional perspective, as a project built on colonization, and understanding that this idea of the contiguous sorry, I just hit the mic there. The idea of this contiguous project of the United States, that it needs to stay together, that it has to be this thing on the map, and that you have to create socialism in that system, that block on the map. I think that needs to be gotten rid of. We need to get rid of that, because the reality is that I don't think that's going to happen. And I think that the project of the United States like that is not permanent. So I'm not saying to go back to the Black Belt thesis at all, because again, we've moved well beyond that. And with the way that populations have migrated, it just wouldn't even work anymore. It wouldn't make sense. But I think that was an interesting analysis, because the reality is that the US is a huge, huge country. And there are so many regional differences that in many other parts of the world would create different countries naturally. So I think that I think the development of socialism in the United States, I'm not even necessarily saying secession or balkanization or whatever. I will say that I think inevitably the United States is going to break up. Maybe not in our lifetimes, but it's too large of a project to keep together, and there's so many internal contradictions. And as we see now with Donald Trump and the Democrats and these two bourgeois parties that won't even recognize their own legitimacy anymore, even though they agree on basically all policies. I think the point is that we have to think about building socialism in the United States not as a project that happens across this massive landmass, but I think it really needs to be a process that is more localized, and but not in like the Murray Bookchin anarchist way, but in the way of like understanding of building this institutional power based on the particular conditions of regions, not of states. The individual states in the US don't matter, but of regions. So I think it makes sense for like the left in California and Arizona and New Mexico to be very different from the left in New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and to be very different from the left in Florida, and very different from the left in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, right? Because like these regions have very particular material conditions that are totally distinct, with the history of slavery in and the history of oppression of Black people in Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, and the unique history of the theft of half of Mexico in 1846 and 1848, and the large population of Chicanos in California and Arizona and New Mexico, and the role that a form of kind of Chicano nationalism can and very much should play in the left there. And the point is that there isn't, I mean, there should be a national unity to these projects, right? But the point is that when I think of the US, the reality is that you can't win socialism through bourgeois elections. It's a dictatorship. The United States is not a democracy. There's no proletarian democracy. It is a bourgeois dictatorship, and there needs to be revolutionary change in the country. But when you think about how revolutionary change happens, it doesn't happen across the entire country at the same time. The Bolshevik Revolution it wasn't the October/November Revolution was not the actual revolution. That was the Bolsheviks taking power. The revolution was the Russian Civil War. And the Chinese Revolution was not 1949. The Chinese Revolution was a 20-year period across the country of a massive civil war. And I'm not in any way, especially to the feds, I'm not calling for a civil war. I do not want a civil war. What I'm saying is something different. I'm saying that a lot of socialists have this idea that like there's going to be like a revolution and then like the entire United States is going to go socialist. No, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that it's going to be like, if you study the Chinese Revolution, it's like Hunan, like it started with like these free areas that were like created socialist governments that expanded. And I'm not saying I'm not saying it in the anarchist way either. It's not going to be like, what was the thing, the Chaz. It's not going to be the Chaz, right? But the point is that I think we need to start thinking about revolutionary change, understanding that it has to be localized in particular ways. And then when people have power, or when revolutionaries have power, it's a matter of expanding further.
Yeah. Yeah, I really wanted to get your thoughts on that, because you guys do a lot of great work, like analyzing imperialism that the U.S. is committing overseas and in Latin America. So I really wanted to get your thoughts on like what socialism could look like here, because there's a lot of people on the synthetic left that say it's not possible here because people have it too good here, especially like the white proletariat. or they're not even proletariats, like we were saying before. So it just wouldn't happen here. There's a lot of people that say that. So I really appreciate your thoughts on that. And I think, as socialists who do go around promoting the socialism with American characteristics and believe that a socialist revolution can happen here, obviously we would center um, oppressed nations that are within the United States, and because we believe in self-determination, and if these oppressed nations want to secede, that's up to them. That's not us to decide.
Absolutely.
It's not
No, I
up.
agree with that. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not up to us to decide it though. Like it's up to them to decide like what territory and how they want it to look like. That's up to them. And
Well, on this note, sorry to cut you off again really quickly, but one quick thought. One of the interesting things about Russia today, and thinking about the Russian Empire before the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation, is looking at the changes in the actual physical geography. Because one of the common critiques made of the Bolsheviks by Russian nationalists, by more conservative Russian nationalists, they complain that the Bolsheviks allowed parts of the Russian Empire to as they say, be taken away in scare quotes, because to them it belonged to the Russian Empire, and they have the kind of Russian chauvinist view. And Lenin wrote about this, about signing the treaty that ended that when the Bolsheviks came in and removed Russia from World War One. And part of that included signing a treaty with the Western powers in World War One, and basically handing over parts of the former Russian Empire to them, to the Western European colonial powers. But the point is that the Bolsheviks their interest was developing socialism, not keeping together the Russian Empire. And I think that a lot of people in the United States, including socialists, their goal, they're actually more concerned about keeping the US empire together than developing socialism, unlike the Bolsheviks, who didn't care about the Russian Empire and had no fealty to it.
yeah,
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. I'm kind of picking up on U.S. imperialism. Since liberals are the most effective evil, what could we expect from a Biden-Harris administration regarding domestic and foreign policy, especially when it comes to Yemen, Syria, Iran, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba? Are we in for ultra woke representational politics as a cover for U.S. aggression? And can you talk to us a little bit about some of the hatred you received from critiquing the term Latinx and the divisions between the ruling class when it comes to their overall strategy and maintaining imperialism and keeping the global proletariat divided?
Yeah, absolutely. A few things. So I'll just start. I'll jump on this grenade on the topic of Latinx. Look,
please do.
people in Latin America don't say Latinx. People were attacking me on Twitter for saying this, but basically no one uses it. And also, I was tweeting that in response to a study that found even in the United States, among Latinos in the United States, only 3% actually, I think, don't quote me on this, but I believe only 3% were even familiar with the term. So a very small percentage of people. I might be, the exact numbers are escaping me right now, but the point is that a very small percentage of Latinos, even in the United States, where the term originates, by the way, it doesn't come from Latin America, use that term or are familiar with it. And the reality is that there is a movement for what's called gender inclusive language, lenguaje inclusivo, and that is a complex discussion. A lot of people in Latin America, even including on the revolutionary left, do not support that. But it's an indigenous project in Latin America. It's not a project of the United States. And it's used in Argentina and some other places. And what they use is, for instance, they would say Latine, because it is true that Spanish is a gendered language. Latino for a man, Latina for a woman. And in Argentina, there and some other countries, there are some people who have created this new system saying using an E instead, Latine. The advantage of that is you can actually pronounce it. No one has. I haven't found anyone who knows how to pronounce Latinx or whatever, because there are some people who say Latinx or Latinx or whatever, which just sounds weird, Latinx, because it's actually not Latin, it's Latino, Latina. So it makes more sense to say Latine, which is what some people in Latin America do. Although again, this is very fringe, it's not very prominent. And it's not really a working class movement. It's largely a petty bourgeois kind of upper middle class, educated, like academic people. But it's not to say that I'm necessarily like opposed to that project if it becomes a working class movement, which it's not. So the issue with the X is that, one, you can't pronounce it. You just can't. And especially when it's in plural. So Latinxs. How do you pronounce that? No one knows how to pronounce it because it's only for writing. And then two, it is a project of the United States that is now trying to be forced onto parts of Latin America that want nothing to do with it. And then finally, the reality is that, yes, Spanish is a gendered language, but that doesn't mean that it's inherently patriarchal. And there are feminists, including very prominent feminists across Latin America in numerous countries, who have spoken out against it, including the most high-profile feminist in Latin America right now. Well, I should say at least the most powerful feminist, who is the vice president of Argentina and former president, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. She has spoken out against this, saying that she doesn't support it. And instead that she supports, there's an attempt in Spanish, people say, compañeros y compañeras. Hugo Chavez also did that a lot. It's very common on the left now. So anyway, whatever. But the reality is that this is a decision that should be made by people in Latin America and not forced on people in Latin America by people in the United States. And it's also something that if it happens, it's going to happen organically among working class people and not be forced down our throats by CNN and the New York Times and Vox. Yeah. That's not a working class movement if Vox.com is telling you to do it. As for the Biden-Harris administration, I mean, this whole thing of intersectional imperialism was kind of a joke, but it really has become kind of their ideology. The Democratic Party, many decades ago, I mean, it's never been a working class party, but because of the reality of the material conditions of US politics in the 1930s, with the Great Depression, with the massive growth of the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, and the massive strength of the labor unions and the militancy, FDR and the Democrats were forced to make an alliance with the left and create the New Deal. And by the 1970s, the Democratic Party totally abandoned the working class. There was a brief period where they were forced to ally with the working class, not because the Democrats were ever a working class party. They've never been, but they were forced to out of an alliance of convenience. And they've been totally decoupled from the working class for decades now. And the Democrats have found that the only way they can win elections anymore is by this blunt neoliberal identity politics and telling everyone who doesn't support them that they're racist and homophobic and sexist. And that's going to be how they're going to try to keep winning elections now, especially as the country becomes less white and as the Republicans become more explicitly white nationalist. So you have two parties that have totally abandoned support for working class people and instead have just resorted to a form of cultural nationalism, which honestly is kind of fascistic, especially for the Republicans, but also in a way kind of for the Democrats too, because it's totally a rigid hierarchy that is divorced from any class politics and tells people that they have to stand in the totem pole according to where their blood quanta tell them they should be.
Yeah.
Like you're born with these racial phenotypes, therefore you go into this block. It's not that different fundamentally from the white nationalism of these Republican fascists like Steve King. So now when that logic's applied to imperialism, it's even worse. And I think what's interesting is that the Democrats are now trying to bring back the white man's burden, but they're making it like the non-gender conforming POC's burden. The non-gender conforming POC imperialist burden is that the US empire is going to bring this like woke politics to the rest of the world. And again, anti-racism is very important. Opposition to patriarchy is important. Opposition to LGBT oppression is important. These are all important things. But the reality is that they're instrumentalizing these struggles, just as Israel's apartheid regime pinkwashes to justify the oppression of Palestinians. And the US empire is realizing that it can more effectively brutalize much of the world, especially the global south, by claiming that they're doing it in order to bring them anti-racism and feminism. I mean, that's exactly what they were doing in Afghanistan. And Amnesty International did ads about supporting women in Afghanistan, endorsing the war, the NATO occupation of Afghanistan. So it's not new, but under the Obama era, it became more and more mainstream. And now it's the hegemonic ideology of not just the Democratic Party, but much of the kind of like big tech ruling class. And it further underscores the serious political conflicts between the big bourgeoisie, if you will, and the small bourgeoisie. That is to say, between the international finance capitalists and Silicon Valley capitalists and Wall Street capitalists on one side, and then the national bourgeoisie in the United States on the other side, who are often the kind of more reactionary forces in terms of kind of racial politics, but they represent a real constituency. And increasingly, the Democrats have become the party of big capital, and the Republicans, it looks like, might become the party of that kind of small capital national bourgeoisie. And it's the even idea of the working class being part of US politics is just going to be totally erased, and it's going to totally become a cultural conflict between the big bourgeoisie and the small bourgeoisie.
So we believe that like Yeltsin coined the term Red-Brown Alliance. Well, we know that it's never been historically true, but can you correctly point out that there's a Blue-Brown Alliance and talk about how liberals have historically aligned themselves with fascists, and how the Obama and Biden administration did just that in Ukraine, maybe even Syria, wherever else you might see it?
Absolutely. I actually learned this from Mark Ames, who's a brilliant journalist and writer who spent a lot of time in the former Soviet Union in the 90s, right after the counter-revolution and coup, and then the neoliberal shock therapy. And I hadn't known this, but as you pointed out, it was actually in the Yeltsin years when that term was first coined, and it was used by the Western imperialists and the Russian neoliberals, who were the ones carrying out a coup, and Yeltsin attacked the Russian parliament with tanks and bombed it to prevent the restoration of the Soviet Union. And they said that anyone who wanted to bring back the Soviet Union, they were in a red-brown alliance between socialists and fascists to bring back the Soviet Union. And we, the great enlightened neoliberals and the Western imperialists, we want democracy embodied in the noble, the personal, physical embodiment of how great bourgeois capitalist democracy is. Boris Yeltsin, a drunk moron, like, who didn't do anything and could barely speak well and spent all of his time just drunk, and Russians hated him. So there you go, with like a 13% approval rating or something that dwindled down and lower. So, I mean, that's a classic example of how this whole red-brown alliance thing from the very beginning was used by imperialists, specifically by left liberal imperialists, like liberals who kind of maybe have like a more leftoid identity, but they're just there's liberal imperialists. And that's still how they use it today. If you are a consistent socialist who are not, if you're not a liberal, then they call you red brown or whatever. Because the reality is that most so-called socialists in the US are still really liberals.
Mhm.
And that's not, I mean, I'm not blaming them. That's a product of the society. The US is a deeply liberal. It's like one of the most liberal societies in the sense of liberalism, not in the way that like Americans use the term liberal to mean like progressive, which is not at all what it means. Liberalism based on bourgeois ideology of individual rights. Like the US is such a deeply individualist country that we do it's best for me and blah blah blah. And that ideology is just so deeply embedded even in a lot of the left, which is also why like anarchism is really popular in the United States when it's not popular, especially in the global south and parts of Western Europe, but it's just not a mass movement in much of the world outside of the global north. What?
What?
Wait, what'd you say?
That was my Ariana Grande version of an infantile disorder.
Oh.
Yeah. So
yeah.
So anyway, the point is that, man, where was I going with that? The Ariana Grande thing. Wait, what was the question again?
The question was, what's your favorite Ariana Grande?
Red brown.
Brown,
So
yeah.
the liberal, really quickly, the blue brown, liberal brown, the liberal fascist alliance.
Mhm.
That is, I mean, that is actually an actually existing political force that is quite common. And when I say liberal, again, I'm not referring just to the American understanding of like Democrats. I mean liberalism. So that would include both Democrats and Republicans who frequently around the world are in alliance with fascists. You mentioned Ukraine. In 2014, there was a coup in which literal neo-Nazis played a significant part, overthrowing the democratically elected government of Ukraine. Why was it started? Because the president, who, I mean, he was corrupt and pretty neoliberal, but he was also democratically elected, Yanukovych, and who was, for them, he was insufficiently anti-Russian. They called him pro-Russian, and he refused to push through an EU free trade deal that would just surrender more of Ukraine's sovereignty to the European Union. So they had this coup against him, in which neo-Nazis played a lead part, including this group called the Azov Battalion, which uses like a modified kind of swastika symbol or like SS style symbol. And then they were later embedded into the Ukrainian National Guard. So these Nazis are part of the Ukrainian state now. And there are photos of US and Canadian soldiers training with them. And that coup was strongly supported by the Obama administration. Victoria Nuland, who's now the number 3 in the Biden State Department, played a key role in that coup. And we can talk about Syria, where, you know, if you support the Syrian people's right to be independent and sovereign with a post-colonial government that's not colonized by the US and isn't just like a puppet regime like most of the other countries in Western Asia and the Middle East, then you're an Assadist in a red-brown alliance. Whereas in reality, the blue-brown alliance, the real fascist alliance, is between the liberal imperialists who supported Al-Qaeda and helped give rise to ISIS, the actual fascists. Meanwhile, it was the Syrian government and Hezbollah and Russia and Iran and also Iraqi forces that defeated ISIS. Those were the anti-fascist forces that defeated ISIS. And by the way, Iran, which, yes, is a theocratic country, it's a Shia country, but Iran defended secular Syria. Syria is one of the only secular remaining governments in the Middle East. And Iran and Iraq helped Syria defend its secular government, and Hezbollah helped it. Meanwhile, the secular United States and ostensibly secular Western Europe and ostensibly secular Turkey, but not so much anymore, all work together, and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which are not secular, and Israel, which is not secular, all teamed up to try to destroy secular Syria. So the real fascists in Syria were the so-called moderate rebels who were just Salafi jihadist fascists, or the liberal imperialist support for fascists to destroy Yugoslavia. And if you oppose the Balkanization of Yugoslavia, then they called you a red brown, and they said you were a supporter of Milosevic and you're a red brown. I mean, it's always used by these left liberals who claim to be progressives, and they say that anyone who's an anti-imperialist is red brown, because the fact is they're actually not part of the left. They're liberals. They're not on the left. They're liberals, and they find the presence of actual socialists who are anti-imperialists threatening. So that's why they ally with fascists in Venezuela, who set black people on fire because they think that they vote for Chavistas, which they've done multiple times in Venezuela, or in Nicaragua, where they supported fascists who burnt down houses of Sandinistas, who marked the houses of Sandinistas. Friends of mine, their houses were marked. That's like Nazi shit.
Yeah.
Like, this is the house of a Sandinista family. Like, and they had the staunch support, of course, of the Donald Trump administration, but also basically every liberal and a lot of so-called progressives, and even some socialists, fake socialists in the United States, who were saying that it was a progressive uprising, just as they supported the fake progressive uprising in Ukraine and Syria and Bolivia, which was led by fascists in Bolivia. And how many people on the fake left supported that? I mean, you can just go down the list again and again.
Yeah, way too many. You mentioned the Syrian government and Iraqi, Iran, and Russia had defeated ISIS, but the Kurds. Let's talk about the Kurds for a second. What is the deal with Rojava? Are the Kurds left wing? Why do people support them? How is the U.S. And NATO using them to protect the oil? And what does this Kurdistan idea have to do with left-wing politics?
Well, first of all, there is no Rojava. That is a Western marketing term used to try to balkanize Syria and other parts, and Iraq and other parts of the Middle East. There is a Kurdish majority area of Syria. And by the way, I used to be much more confused about this stuff, but I read a lot of stuff, and I had some interesting interviews, including with this guy Ali Ornek, who is a Turkish Kurd and a socialist, a communist, who an anti-imperialist and very brilliant writer and intellectual. And I did an interview with him, and I had some discussions with him, and realized that, look, the reality is, it's absolutely true that Kurds have been oppressed in parts of the Middle East and of Western Asia. It's 100% true, especially Turkey, which they've faced kind of fascistic repression and persecution. But what I learned from him, and then did further reading later on to confirm it, the struggle, the history of Kurds in Syria is very different than that in Turkey. It's not at all the same, or of Iraq. In Syria, Kurds had way more rights and were treated much more equitably by the government. And in fact, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, founded by Öcalan, which kind of had Marxist-Leninist origins, but then became like this weird anarcho-liberal democratic confederalist thing. Well, in its more militant early days, when it was still Marxist-Leninist, kind of actually more MLM, Marxist-Leninist Maoist, the PKK, its leader Öcalan, was based in Syria and supported by Hafez al-Assad. And when Hafez al-Assad died, the PKK in its official newspaper organ wrote an obituary praising him and thanking Syria for its support. And there was actually something after the the Hama uprising of the Muslim Brotherhood Islamist Salafi jihadist forces in the 1980s in Syria in Hama, which was supported by Turkey and the United States to try to overthrow the Ba'athist government, which, by the way, the Ba'athist government in Syria hated the Ba'athist government in Iraq. Saddam Hussein his rise was supported by the CIA. I mean, that's a long conversation. We don't have time to get into, but the Syrian Baathists were the left wing of that split, and the Iraqi Baathists were the right wing of the split. And they were the ones who were anti-Kurdish. The Syrians were much more supportive of religious and ethnic minorities, and the Syrian government is still one of the most protecting of religious and ethnic minorities. Their rights are enshrined in the Constitution. And after the Hama uprising of the Muslim Brotherhood Salafi jihadist forces in the 80s, there was a kind of thing called the undeclared war between Turkey and Syria, where Turkey would support these Islamist forces to attack the Syrian government, and the Syrian government supported the PKK and left-wing Kurdish guerrilla forces to attack the Turkish government. And then eventually they had to have an agreement, and Syria agreed to kick out Öcalan. Since then, the PKK looked for other sources of support and turned right and became more liberal. And Öcalan was arrested with the backing of the CIA. It's true. The Clinton administration, the CIA helped Turkey arrest Öcalan. And then supposedly in prison, and I think that this should be questionable, because whether or not, I don't trust the Turkish government to release Öcalan's letters, but supposedly in Turkish prison, Öcalan started releasing these letters renouncing Marxism-Leninism and becoming like this weird liberal anarchist thing, reading Murray Bookchin, who was a total imperialist, who loved Israel, who was a Zionist. And anyway, so supposedly, according to these letters that Turkey allowed to be released or something, we don't really know the provenance of them, Öcalan told the PKK to adopt this ideology. And then you have the rise of the PYD, which is the political arm in Syria. And then the protests happen in Syria. And then the international proxy war to try to destroy Syria happens. And the YPG is formed. And to be fair, the YPG was partially formed to defend Kurdish communities, civilians, against these Salafi jihadist fascists, these Al-Qaeda fanatics who wanted to kill Kurds, many of whom are secular. Even though they're Sunni, they're secular, so they were considered apostates. And these fascists, backed by the US and Western Europe and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey, were killing them. So to be fair, they formed the self-defense units, and they were defending their communities, but then they allied with US imperialism. I mean, so the thing about the Kurdish struggle in Turkey is that it's absolutely a legitimate struggle against a very brutal regime that does not even give them the right to speak their own language. In Syria, they had the right to speak the language. They had elements of autonomy. The reality is that the YPG leadership was very opportunistic, and they chose to ally with US imperialism. And they started carving out this region in the Northeast that was being defended by the US military. And there were a series of negotiations. There have been for years now, a series of negotiations between the YPG, the Kurdish-led forces, and the Syrian government, the national government, because they're still Syrian citizens who are part of the Syrian government. And those negotiations didn't really go anywhere because the Syrian Kurdish leadership claimed that it gave up the idea of secession, but they never really did. They were secretly, they were hoping that it might happen, and it didn't happen. And they thought that they could play the US against the Syrian government and try to get what was best for them. Of course, you can't play the empire against an anti-colonial, a post-colonial force. That's not, you side with the post-colonial force against imperialism. It's an insane, ridiculous move. But increasingly, the YPG became more and more protected by the United States and relied more on the US to prevent Turkey from attacking it, and sold out. I mean, they totally sold out. And I'm sympathetic to elements of the Kurdish struggle, but the YPG leadership does not represent. I mean, they at this point they do not represent the Kurdish people. They represent the Kurdish bourgeoisie who decided to sell their land to the U.S. empire, which isn't even their land. It's Syrian land. They're part of Syria. They share that land, but it wasn't their land to give. And this is also the land in Syria that is the breadbasket region that produces much of the wheat and has most of the oil. So the U.S., they don't even care about the Kurdish struggle. I mean, how many times has the U.S. abandoned the Kurds in Iraq, in Syria? I mean, it's so many times. They don't care about Kurdish self-determination. They wanted to use this region to starve the Syrian government of revenue that it needs to rebuild, that it could have gotten through selling oil and that it can't get now. And it's also caused food shortages and bread shortages specifically. And they eat a lot of bread in the Middle East, especially in Syria and the Levant. So look, the people, I was a little more sympathetic at first. And look, I know people, including Marxist-Leninists, who so a few who went to Syria and fought with the YPG. Some of them are very disappointed. They recognize what happened. That's not to say that, like, I don't agree with the analysis that, like, from day one they were always like the YPG and like these Kurdish forces were always like agents of imperialism. Like there is an indigenous history there of struggle, and we shouldn't discount like the history of the Kurds. And like there are people who say like the Kurds are fake or not real. That's ridiculous. But the reality, the blunt reality that we have to admit and is staring everyone in the face is the YPG sold out their struggle to US imperialism and sold out their country to US imperialism. And now what are they going to get? Nothing. They get the worst of both worlds, because the US is going to abandon them eventually when they're no longer useful. And the Syrian government doesn't want anything to do with them because they've betrayed their country. And by the way, I should mention that repeatedly in the negotiations between the Syrian government and the Kurdish-led forces, which rebranded at the demand of the US military as the SDF, just bowing down to the US military who told them to rebrand as the Syrian Democratic Forces. In the negotiations, the Syrian government was telling them that they could have autonomy in the region, that there could be this kind of Kurdish autonomous region in the northeast, but they would not allow an independent standing army in the region. They said that the YPG could be integrated into the Syrian Arab Army, the SAA, which is the National Army of Syria, and that the YPG could even maintain its structure as like as a unit within the Syrian army. The Kurdish leadership said no, they refused to, because the reality is that they wanted to maintain their independent military force so one day they could potentially secede. So at every stage, the reality is that, look, there's stuff to criticize the Syrian government about. I mean, I'm not pretending like it's some great, perfect government at all. But if you look at the negotiations that have been reported on by Al Monitor and other news outlets, the reality is that the Syrian government was willing to compromise and meet them more than halfway, but the YPG wanted it all. And now this is what they get. They don't have the Syrian government to fall back on, and the US is going to abandon them. I mean, what's going to happen is that eventually the US is going to abandon them like it did with Trump, where they withdrew forces from Afrin, and then the Kurds there get slaughtered by Turkey, by these fascists backed by Turkey, these former so-called moderate rebels who were once backed by the CIA and are now backed by Turkey. So then they flee, and then what did they do? They asked the Syrian Arab Army to come in to protect them from Turkey, and that's what they
showed up. Of course, Syria showed up, right?
And that's what Damascus did do. Even though the YPG has continued to stab Damascus in the back, Damascus agreed to send troops, and Turkey agreed to withdraw. Well, they didn't withdraw. They agreed to stop expanding. They still colonized Afrin. So it's a lesson that if you are, and it's a lesson for other countries, and it's an example of what the US would like to do to so many other regions like Xinjiang, like Hong Kong. But it's an example of an example of how imperialism can use a left-wing force as imperialist assets to balkanize a country, to try to balkanize a country. Usually it's right-wing forces, but in this case, I mean, just as the US allied with China when Mao was still alive against the Soviet Union. I mean, there's not many examples of it, but there are examples of it historically.
I think it's also really interesting, like all the videos you see of Assad, like telling the Kurds that the USA is going to betray them, and he's right, like every single time.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually,
Like,
no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
oh, okay. But to kind of continue on that, the U.S. intervention and sanctions has caused 500,000 deaths in Syria. Why is the USA so committed to overthrowing Assad? I mean, that might be obvious, like to us, but like, could you break that down in layman's terms, please?
Yeah, I mean, there's never one reason. There's always a multitude of reasons, and
Right.
it's like, and it's true for so many countries. But for Syria, a few things. One, Syria it maintains an anti-imperialist foreign policy, refuses to recognize Israel, while the Gulf monarchy puppet regimes are all normalizing relations with Israel. Syria is an ally of Iran and Hezbollah and Russia. It's actually one of the site of Russia's only warm water port, and it has very close military relations with Russia and increasingly with China as well. And Syria has been a thorn in the side of US and before that British domination of the Middle East. And this is an extremely important region, not just for hydrocarbons, which is of course a huge part of it, oil and gas. And it's true that there have been plans attempting to build a gas pipeline through Syria. The entire war is not about that, but that's a factor. You know, it's always these things are always factors. Just as right now the US is trying to sabotage the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany. And Mike Pompeo, until recently Secretary of State, he said that the US would, quote, do anything to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So, I mean, why wouldn't they do it in other places? So these are all factors. And then the reality is that Syria is one of the only remaining countries in the region that had a kind of revolutionary, I mean, you can call it a revolution. It was more of a kind of a coup, but it was a kind of revolutionary coup against a colonial regime that installed a post-colonial nationalist government and that doesn't follow orders from Western capital and has still maintained, even though it's true that, especially under Bashar in the early 2000s, it's true that elements of the economy were privatized. There were some neoliberal reforms pushed through after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Syria was a very close ally of the Soviet Union. And a lot of countries where they had been, you know, when there was a socialist trading bloc, it's easier to maintain those policies. But the reality is that, you know, maintaining socialism in one country, especially when you're under siege through sanctions and imperialist attacks, is extremely difficult, as we see with the DPRK. So a lot of these countries were forced to undergo some more liberalization. But the reality is that compared to other countries in the region, Syria still maintains a lot of state ownership of the economy, like Iraq did, even under Saddam. So there's a lot of reasons. Forcibly privatizing the Syrian economy so Western capital can devour Syrian capital, so they can forcibly privatize state resources and institutions, so they can take Syrian natural resources, so they can create a puppet regime that will recognize Israel and break off support for Iran and further isolate Iran in the region, so they can so they can create another compliant puppet regime near Russia. Let's keep in mind that for Russia, Western Asia the so-called Middle East is very close to Russia. These are like basically neighboring countries. So installing an anti-Russian government to further encircle Russia, installing a government that will not have good relations with China. I mean, these are all factors. And what I can tell you is that what is not a factor in the war is human rights. It's not even on. It's not that doesn't fucking matter in any way. It's never considered for a second to Western policymakers. That's just the marketing.
Yeah. It's I think with the Biden administration, what we're going to see a lot of like human rights intervention. I think we're going to see a lot of rainbow drones, and if it weren't like Obama was good at it, but like it's going to be even more sinister and heinous under a Biden administration. And I really think that it's we've really got to buckle down on that before it really gets started. And having like resources available is going to be key. So I hope you're saving all your links in a Google document. Google's going to try to hide that shit, you know. There's like several key articles I have literally copy and pasted into my Google Doc. And like that EcoWatch article, Syria and the pipeline war, like I have that printed out. I did like a couple other ones so that I could just be like, look, this is really why we hate Russia. And so I kind of keeping on like a similar topic.
Wait, I also want to point out something that Ben said that's really important, like the siege socialism. Is something that is lost on the left here. I think the reason why existing social states haven't been able to reach full socialism is because they're under siege. Siege socialism limits their capacity. This is why it would be in everyone's interest that the proletariat mobilizes socialist revolution here in the empire and in other imperialist nations in order to bring about full socialism everywhere else. And I think this is rooted in the synthetic left, where they go around saying that it's not possible, but that's only because the synthetic left only knows defeat, pessimism, and destruction.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting point. Try to keep it brief. You know, Trotskyites will talk about the conflict in the Soviet Union after Lenin's death as the ideological conflict between Trotsky, who supported exporting the revolution, and evil Stalin, who was a nationalist, who supported socialism in one state. I mean, that's a ridiculous, infantile, like Isaac Deutscher understanding of what was actually happening. I mean, that's the Trot reading. The reality is that the Bolsheviks thought that they were convinced that there was going to be revolution in other parts of Western Europe, which would spread, and especially in Germany, which came close, but the Social Democrats allied with the proto-fascists to crush the communists and kill Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. But
imagine when they went siding with fascists to stop a revolution.
Exactly. Talking about the blue-brown alliance.
Right.
So, but anyway, the point is that the Soviet Union recognized the leadership. It wasn't just Stalin. Leadership recognized that it wasn't going to happen. That that revolution they were hoping would come in Western Europe wasn't going to come. And were they going to just allow their current revolutionary government to be overthrown, or are they going to try to figure out a way to govern? Right. And they decided, we're going to govern. And our goal eventually is to continue to spread socialism, but we want to be able to continue with our current revolutionary government and not just give up and collapse. So the Trotskyite argument was basically, if Trotsky had won out and been in charge, the Soviet Union probably would have been overthrown in the earlier mid-20s. Yeah. I mean, like, it would not have. He would have tried like some insane war to bring about a revolution in Germany by force. It wouldn't have worked. All of the Western European powers would have united in a war against the Soviet Union, and it would have been overthrown. And
collaborator with
Yeah, I mean, that's later on. I mean, talking about the
Right.
20s here, but the point is that this idea of like socialism in one state as like being something that people want is dumb. That's not. It's a misunderstanding. That's a liberal understanding. It's
Yeah.
a reality. It's a recognition of the material reality of the particular historical and material conditions that these countries are faced. Of course, the Soviet Union would have wanted other socialist countries to build a larger bloc, so it wouldn't have to develop socialism in one country, but it wasn't able to. And similarly, with DPRK, with Venezuela, with Cuba, with many countries, they have been forced into these sieges and they refuse to just allow the country to be overthrown. So, like you just said, we have to understand some of the weaknesses and contradictions in these countries as not entirely, but as largely products of that contradiction. And that's true for many of the contradictions and problems of the Soviet Union as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's
Um,
impressive that it survived so long,
what
considering
in Russia, you mean?
in the Soviet Union, it's impressive that it survived so long, considering the incredible obstacles, considering losing 26 million people in the worst war in human history. I mean, just the constant attacks and the coup attempts and the sabotage. And I mean, the
Genocide.
liberals talk about the Iron Curtain as if the Soviet Union wanted the Iron Curtain. And not that it
Right.
was imposed on the socialist bloc by NATO imperialist countries who
Right.
refused to allow trade and interaction with the socialist bloc.
They somehow like block all the outside stuff out, like how like these huge imperialist powers somehow had nothing to do with the decisions that they decided they had to undertake to protect the revolution and the proletarian democracy that they had.
No, it's like they want you to believe that the Soviet Union wanted to be closed off, just like the DPRK wants to be closed off. It's not that it's under medieval sanctions and has been under medieval sanctions for decades.
It's wild. Like, and also we're gonna go into another rant, but like like liberals think that like human rights are these eternal thing, and it's just that's not how it is. It's tied into economic and political stability.
Yeah, well, liberals think that human rights means the right of the government not to kill you unless you're poor or black, or if you have like a disease that if you don't get treatment for, you're going to die. And in that case, you don't have human rights.
Right.
You're not guaranteed medical treatment. You're not guaranteed a job. You're not guaranteed food. All you're guaranteed is that the government might not kill you, maybe, unless you're a poor black person and there's a cop on the street.
Right. Of course, we do have more questions, but obviously we can keep those for another time because we would
Yeah,
love,
I'd be happy to come back sometime.
yeah, because we obviously want you to get your sleep because you're leaving tomorrow, right, for Ecuador.
2 days,
Oh,
yeah.
2 days. Okay. Yeah, no. We can totally wrap up now. We wanted to ask you about Putin real quick, but I don't know if you have time to answer that.
Putin and Lula and like of course South
Actually,
America.
yeah.
Uh,
You can pick which one.
Well, we just hit 2 hours, so
We
let's
should
keep
wrap.
that for next time.
Okay, let's keep it for next time. All right. Uh, well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us on the Red Lettuce. Before we wrap up, let people know where they can find your work.
Well, you can find my reporting at thegrayzone.com, gray with an A. I don't really talk about theory and stuff that much there, but I sometimes tweet about it. You can find me at Benjamin Norton. And I sometimes will blog about this stuff at bennorton.com, but I mostly talk about it in interviews and stuff and podcasts. And I have a podcast with Max Blumenthal called Moderate Rebels. So you can check that out. And thanks for having me. It was a fun discussion. I always love to talk about these more complex theoretical questions because I'm a journalist, so I mostly focus on kind of concrete politics, but it's good to balance. A lot of socialists in the US are too theory heavy and not enough heavy. They don't study history enough. And in terms of their political work, they have very little actual political work. But as a journalist, I feel like the opposite problem. It's all like history and focusing on like what's going on, but not enough theory. So it's good to balance the two sometimes.
That means a lot to me, and I know that means a lot to Eric, because like all we do is talk about this shit. All we do is read about like what our country is up to. We like try to keep on top of our history as well, and it's so thank you for saying that, and thank you for letting us pick your brain. I've been a Ben Norton fan for a while. So it's been a pleasure to pick your brain and hang out with you for a little bit. I hope you will join us and chat with what's going on in Ecuador, and we can get firsthand account.
I'd love to come back. Yeah, it was fun. It was fun hanging out.
It's been. We look forward to catching up with you soon.
Cool. And are you going to conclude this episode with a Britney Spears song?
No, but I am going to teach you a Welsh word. Are you ready?
Oh, hell yeah, I'm ready.
Yeah. Annibyniaeth.
One more time?
Annibyniaeth.
Annibyniaeth?
Yeah, it means independence.
Annibyniaeth. Excellent. Yes, everyone should support Welsh independence. We want a socialist Wales, a socialist anti-imperialist Wales, like Ireland, like with the peak of the Irish nationalist Republican struggle, with when they were like working with the PLO and the PFLP, and we want that in Wales.
Oh yeah. Welsh Twitter is wild. Like last weekend, there was a lot of like discourse about like not appropriating the like Black and Indigenous language, talking about colonialism, because yeah, Wales is a colony of the United Kingdom, but it's also participated in colonization. So like there was it was crazy. I had trouble keeping up with it.
Well, yeah, and then I mean, this last final note here, we were talking about whiteness and white supremacy and imperialism. I didn't even mention the most obvious example, Ireland. Mm-hmm. I mean, the idea that imperialism is motivated by white supremacy and not vice versa is the classic example. The counterexample is Ireland. Clearly, the English were motivated by white supremacy when they colonized Ireland. No, but when you're colonizing Ireland, you don't need white supremacy. But when you're colonizing parts of the world where the majority of people are Black and brown, white supremacy is a political tool you use to justify that conquest. So anyway, just tying everything back together to what we were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah, and that's why we brought you on, because you're really good at that. So we really appreciate your time with us, and we look forward to more interactions with you.
Yeah, me too. I look forward to it.